a friend of mine introduced me to Martha and the work that she's been doing. And so I got inspired by that because we know the gut-brain connection is key. It's so important. And um, Martha is a woman on a journey. She's a woman on a personal journey. She was working in the world of accounting and a businesswoman. And she'll tell you about her husband, John, who came down, who lived with Parkinson's, and he inspired her, the love of her life. And I think because when they went to their first doctor and the doctor said, you have Parkinson's, here's a pill, see you in 6 months, Martha is not going to stop there. And she didn't. And for the last 20 years, she's been doing tons of research that she'll tell us about. We're going to focus on sugar today, but she has been speaking a lot and spreading her information. And I just want to say that her husband being a very important part of her journey and the love of her life. We are doing this session in his memory, in his honor. We planned to have Martha speak to us. I think we booked this about 4 months ago. And a month ago, I heard the news that John passed away. And I wrote to Martha and I said, please, I understand if you don't want to do this workshop with us, we'll postpone it. And she had said, no, we are doing this in memory of my husband, in honor of my husband, and this is our work. So I want to introduce everybody today to Martha, and welcome.
Thank you, Susan. And maybe just to start, so John actually had a pulmonary embolism, a heart attack caused by a pulmonary embolism, which we think may have been connected. He had COVID at the end of 2021, and he had some long COVID symptoms that I think Parkinson's sort of exacerbates that, or the two things kind of can overcomplicate COVID. And it appears that may have been, one of the driving factors behind that. But I'm actually working on with some researchers to try to understand even those connections with the cardiovascular system and blood clotting, and how that could also be connected to some of the drivers that are driving Parkinson's. So today we're gonna talk about sugar. So maybe just to go back to the beginning. So John was diagnosed in November 2nd. So it's almost the anniversary date of 2002. And he was just 44 years old. And he was a very healthy, athletic, marathon running young man. And it didn't make any sense to me. And I had a background in something called transaction flow review, which is how you look at a business to understand everything that's flowing through the business, to look for where your risk might be. And so I kind of looked at Parkinson's and I said, well, transaction flow review seems like a good place to start to try to understand what those contributing factors might be. And of course, food is the main thing flowing through our body. So all the way back in 2002, I started looking at the food supply and what we were exposed to. And John had happened to be drinking some soy protein shakes. He had a soy protein shake every single day, or almost every single day, for the 2 years leading up to his diagnosis. So I felt initially there, there must be some connection to that. And so I studied, I started studying the food supply and how soy was grown and the chemicals that were used on it. And that's where I was first introduced to organophosphate herbicides. And what a lot of people don't realize is these herbicides that are used in agriculture were actually first developed during World War II and World War I as nerve agents. So if we think about what's going on in Parkinson's, there's clearly a connection to, something that is a nerve agent being put in widespread on our food. And it fast forward many years, it took me a long time to understand some of the connections to sugar. But sugar is actually, so the cane plant, the way they dry down cane at the end of the growing season to harvest the cane is they actually use these organophosphates like glyphosate on the sugar, on the plant. And so you get a lot of residues in the sugar itself from that process. So even that connection to sugar went all the way back to where I very first started studying, the neurotoxins in the food supply. But along the way, I mean, about 10 years in, I discovered the microbiome. So that's the trillions of bacteria that live in and on our body, and they really function as our internal pharmacy to maintain our health. So the microbes in our gut are manufacturing many of the vitamins, hormones, and neurotransmitters that we need to be healthy. And that includes dopamine. Microbes can make dopamine. They can also eat dopamine. And one in particular that is known to eat dopamine is an organism called H. pylori that is also known to cause ulcers. And some researchers at Harvard have actually shown that gut bacteria can be eating your medicine. So people who have more trouble with off times can sometimes, if you look and see if you have H. pylori in your gut, that may be contributing to increased off time. But let's go back to sugar for a moment because that's our main topic today. Over the years, I've interviewed lots of people with Parkinson's, and I just kind of take notes about their life story, and also would ask about diet and eating history. And then, of course, I've been to many Parkinson's research conferences, Parkinson's support groups, and I found it very interesting that every single one of those that I went to always brought a lot of sweets, bowls of candy, donuts, cookies, and then I began to talk to people with Parkinson's about, their sweets habit. And of course, the brain needs glucose for energy. But if we become insulin resistant, that it becomes more and more difficult for that glucose to get into the brain. And there are some research papers in both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's now calling it type 3 diabetes, where you get insulin resistance of the brain. And if you're interested, I actually did a podcast with two young women sisters. One of them is actually a nutritionist, and we were talking about some of this. And so that might be an interesting adjunct to listen to. It's a 2-part interview, and their podcast is called Critical Conversations about women's health, but that conversation is about Parkinson's. It's not just about women. But over the years, I also was able to get a large data set from a hospital system that had over 10,000 Parkinson's patients in it, and to do some analysis around that to see what other issues or comorbidities, as they're called, that people with Parkinson's had. And the top two were blood sugar related. So either diabetes, pre-diabetes, hyper or hypoglycemia, so this blood sugar dysregulation, and issues with lipids or cholesterol. And so again, those kind of go back to our diet and what are we eating and how all of that's connected. And so that was also affirming. They've also done some research using, and I'm not a fan of this because I don't think they know enough about the long-term effects of it, but these new what are called GLP-1 drugs, like Ozempic. There is some research ongoing to using that potentially, and they have done some research in diabetes drugs with limited success in Parkinson's. So there's kind of all these pieces pointing to sugar potentially being a part of the problem. However, I really think that one of the big parts of sugar is this connection all the way back to the drying down process and these herbicides and the organophosphates, because what happens in our gut bacteria is the gut bacteria use what we're eating, and they make all of these things in our gut factory. Well, the herbicides kill a lot of the good bacteria that we need in our gut to make these molecules, and dopamine being one of them. And so as we get a depleted gut microbiome, we have less capacity to be able to make the things we need. And what happens is also the gut bacteria that are resistant to these chemicals are often the pathogens. And this also tied back to some early notes that I made in talking to people with Parkinson's, that as children, many of them had had a long history of repeated strep throat infections, or some people had a history of acne and taking antibiotics for acne. So there was this history of repeated antibiotic exposures, which again is lowering those gut bacteria that can deal with that. And strep, as it happens, is an organism that really likes glucose. It grows on glucose, and there are many downstream effects to having selected gut bacteria by eating a high sugar diet. So one of the things I talk to people about a lot is the choices that you're making in your diet. And I know it is very difficult to resist sugar because I think what's happening is our brain is telling us it needs glucose, but the glucose isn't able to get into our brain. So I think this is going to be, the connection to insulin resistance and Parkinson's is going to be an interesting future area of exploration. But maybe for a minute, I'd just like to make this a little bit more interactive in terms of understanding from this group whether or not you do have a strong affinity for sugar. I've also, I've talked to other people with Parkinson's who said, I didn't really eat much sugar. And I think the other night on our call, someone said, their husband wasn't that attracted to sugar until he started taking the dopamine medication, and then he craves sugar all the time. And that's something I haven't explored, but I'm very interested in exploring. So I'm curious, if anybody in the group would like to share their relationship with sugar, or how that may or may not impact them.
If you're not shy, you can just unmute and talk to us. Otherwise, if you are shy, you can put it in the chat. Anybody? Rob, do you want to say something? I see you.
Does Susan break in now, or?
Yeah.
Wait, you unmute, Rob.
Yes, I will.
I thought so.
I think I was always from childhood had some sugar, candy. My mother was into it. As I got older, less. And I don't know what's considered too much sugar, but I was diagnosed with Parkinson's 2017. Sorry, 2018. And my diet's always been good except for sugar. I haven't had red meat in 35 years. The last 10 years or so, I've been a pescatarian. But my one thing I need is sugar. And it always comes after I eat, whether it's a cookies, and the worst time is after dinner, because until I go to bed, anything I can find that's sweet, I'm eating. As far as my cholesterol, I never thought I had a cholesterol problem. I go to a doctor every year. I was always borderline. Lo and behold, I had to have 2 stents put in 2 years ago. And they put you on the cholesterol medication, and my cholesterol has been super good since I've been on the medication. But so that's the history. There's no I've never had blood sugar issues. I get my blood taken all the time. It's never been brought to my attention. And for myself personally, I was caught in I'm losing my mind here.
Must be that sugar high.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I always wondered where I got Parkinson's from. Sorry, I was caught in 9/11.
Yeah.
And I did get cancer, they believe, as a result of 9/11. And I beat that, thank God. And I always thought Parkinson's must have had something to do with the air, all the chemicals in the air, et cetera, et cetera. And when I became part of the World Trade Center health program, the doctors would tell me, yeah, we see a lot more people with Parkinson's these days, but they've never made the actual connection to that. So that's my story.
Thank you, Rob. We know it's connected, right, Martha?
Yes, I mean, there are so many.
Excuse me, I'm not hearing anything. What happened? Uh-oh.
Who's not hearing anything? Hello?
No.
Go ahead, Martha.
I'm not hearing anything.
Simone is not hearing anything.
Simone, okay. I don't know, must be on your side.
Let me just see if I can.
Can everybody hear?
Can you hear?
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Martha.
There's so many different chemical exposures, and I know we were going to talk about sugar today, but I do talk about the chemical exposures a lot in the food. And I run a book club with people in my of my customers, and a lot of the books that we cover are on food and health. And we actually did a book last night called Dark Calories that is about seed oils. And so that's like canola oil and corn oil and all of these supposedly healthier oils that were touted for such a long time, and what those do to our body. And as I was reading that book, and one of the women in my group is actually a nutritionist whose husband has Parkinson's, and she said it was the most earth-shattering book she had read since nutrition school. And
What's the name of that book? And I'll put it in the chat.
Called Dark Calories by, I think her name is Catherine Shanahan. She also wrote a book a few years back about ancestral diets. But I started thinking about like my history of cooking, and I did cook a lot with seed oils before I knew this. And John, of course, as a bachelor, I'm sure he was eating out a lot before we got married, which is a lot of seed oils. And they talk about how actually that in your diet can create this insulin resistance and the inability to get glucose in the brain, and where you can end up actually with hypoglycemia, and then you're seeking out, something sweet. She called it pathological hunger. And that really resonated with me because even like going all the way back to John's childhood and his best friend, we were talking about, John was always thin his whole life, but he could never get enough food. He was constantly hungry. And if there was food in front of him, he was eating everything he could put his hands on. But I don't think he was getting the nutrition out of it. And he certainly, I think, was deficient in getting, the glucose that he needed for his brain. And so I think there are some pieces of that puzzle that really need to be put together in terms of, what's going on with some of these things that have been in the food supply for the last 50 years.
Should we be eating with vegetable oil? I mean, what do you use instead of?
Well, no, I mean, you need to like butter and ghee and coconut oil. So it's kind of an earth-shattering book if you read the details of it. And she has like a 2-week plan about how to go, but she goes into quite a bit of detail on what's going on in terms of the metabolic shift in the body and the problem driving insulin resistance in these fats that are not natural. So most of those vegetable oils, seed oils, corn oils are highly processed oils that also came about as part of the war. So they were, developed as lubricants or things to be used in the war machine. And then after the war was over, it's like, okay, what do we do with this stuff? Well, let's,
Right. Let's eat it.
Clean it up and rebrand it as a healthy alternative oil. And so that connection to what she called pathological hunger really resonated for me. So like, Robert, what you're describing, like after dinner, you're seeking out sugar. So some of that may be your body knows, okay, when you go to sleep at night and you're not eating, when your blood sugar drops, typically what the body would do is it would burn fat to generate sugar for your brain. But if you have the fats from seed oils stored in your body, it doesn't want to burn those fats because they're toxic. So it may be that your body is trying to counterbalance. If you do eat a seed oil diet, it's trying to say, okay, I know I'm getting ready to go to sleep. I want to load up some more glucose in the system so that my blood sugar doesn't drop too low while I'm sleeping. It's very fascinating research and a bit counterintuitive, but I think it explains some of those hunger behaviors that we see. And John was, I mean, I can't tell you how voracious his appetite was, and that he was never fully satisfied by the food.
Well,
do you have
personally, I'm never hungry and I'm never full. It's a weird dynamic, but I eat because it's time to eat. And then when I eat, that's when I get have the sugar problem right after eating. But if I didn't eat for a day, I could care less. Or if I kept eating all day, I could care less.
That's very interesting. There's a gentleman with Parkinson's that I met who reversed a lot of his symptoms following a long-term fasting protocol, which was quite interesting. But in talking to him, I said, that's probably not going to be practical for most people, or you would certainly need to be working with a physician. And I don't think there are many physicians who would undertake, that kind of a protocol with people. But he started following the work of, I think his name is Dr. Michael Phillips. He's a Australian, well, he's an American, but he's a researcher in Australia and in clinical practice over there. And so that work is very interesting too, because fasting can sometimes reset all of those signals in the body, whether it's the hunger signal or burn off the toxic fat that you need to get rid of. So that's also an interesting exercise. It looks like Roger has his hand up.
exactly?
So I was diagnosed in 2005. I got DBS in 2019. And I'm a triple stroke survivor. My stroke symptoms butt heads with Parkinson. And I'm okay with sugar until I take the first bite, and then I can't stop.
You can't stop.
Yeah. I can't, but I say no, 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 no. I'm okay until the first yes. And then I can't. I also was exposed to trichlor TC for 10 years.
So you mentioned you had several strokes. Is that what you said?
3.
3. So that's also, I'll say, another connection. So I'm working with a scientist in Australia who is, his background is in colloidal chemistry and he actually founded the Department of Applied Mathematics at Australia National University. But one of the things, so he's been helping me look at Parkinson's from a different viewpoint of the what's going on in the microbiome and how it's impacting even the vasculature. So your stroke comments are interesting because he thinks that some of what's going on with the brain is a collapse of something called the glycocalyx and endothelial surface layer, which is what is delivering oxygen and nitrogen into the blood and removing the carbon dioxide, and different factors that cause that to collapse and cause these little miniature strokes. So, you know, what you're describing is kind of confirms that to me. And you know, the comment that you make about, like, if you're trying to say, no, 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 I'm not going to eat the sugar. And then when you have that first bite, you can't stop. And that's also the same thing that I think John would experience for a long time. And you know, our kids even remember, finding him in the pantry and in the middle of the night, you know, in there eating up a whole bag of Oreos or something.
That is me exactly. I would love to get more info after class.
Who is the doctor who's doing the oxygen research? That
His name is Dr. Barry Ninham, Ninham. And the part of the Parkinson's theory, I mean, he has a very large scale theory of, based on all of his life's work. He's in his 80s. His life's work in all these different research areas that can explain a lot of the unexplainable things. And as a part of that, we got connected on the Parkinson's side, and he started connecting what's going on in the battle in the gut with the gut bacteria. And so when we look at the Parkinson's gut microbiome, there are often more what are called gram-negative bacteria, certain pathogenic bacteria, which again goes back to the herbicide and the chemicals in the food, and probably the chemicals we're breathing from 9/11. Those select for certain microbes in the body that can handle those things, but those bacteria produce an enzyme called urease, and I'm getting kind of technical here, but that actually kills the good bacteria, and then the good bacteria dump out a bunch of calcium and potassium, which causes this tremendous electrolyte imbalance, and that's what collapses the vasculature and causes that loss of the oxygen, basically.
okay. So
I hope that was probably clear as mud.
the oxygen, we're doing some breathing work, and I think that's super important for everybody, that everybody, I feel like, is not getting enough.
Yes, and you know, that's also just something I generally, you know, with Parkinson's, posture becomes a problem, and you know, you're not getting that opening of the chest and the movement of the
Right,
diaphragm. So, you know, it's that stiffening and hardening. And, you know, part of this gentleman's work, Dr. Ninham, is, you know, he's a colloid chemist in part, but those can get very hard. So part of what drove that whole discussion with him was the work, which I didn't talk about. You know, I founded a company back in 2015 called the Bio Collective, where we we collected fecal samples from people across the population, but a large group of those were people with Parkinson's. And the young women in my lab came to me one day and they said, well, we can tell if somebody has Parkinson's just by looking at their stool sample. And it's like concrete. So if we go back again to the bad bacteria, and those bad bacteria like sugar, killing the good bacteria, and then you get calcium and potassium. Calcium and potassium is what makes that very concrete-like colloidal stool that is hard to pass. It's hard to get nutrients out of, and you can't get water into it. So all of those pieces start fitting together. And, you know, the bad guys in your gut are selected in large part by the environment they're in, which comes from the food. So that can be sugar, that can be the chemicals in the processed foods, or that can be things that you are breathing in from the air, which, you know, 9/11 would be that. I also have a number of people that I'm talking to who live in agricultural areas where certain times of the year their symptoms get worse because they're doing the harvest or they're doing more spraying and there's a lot more in the air. And also, there's a place called Parkinson's Alley that is in the Central Valley of California, where 50% of the produce consumed in America is grown.
Wow. Listen, you developed a product called Sugar Shift. How is that shifting our sugar? Tell us about BiotiQuest and the probiotic that you've been working on.
So I went to the World Parkinson's Congress in 2016, and there was a group of, I want to say it was Israeli Parkinson's patients who had found this research from a scientist there that showed that the sugar alcohol mannitol could stop the clumping of the proteins that are associated with Parkinson's, and actually in an animal model could clear them out of the brain, so clear the waste. And they actually have, it's a little bit hard to find now, but they have a website called Clinic Crowd. And they did a documentary on Vimeo a few years back, where they actually had Parkinson's patients just taking oral mannitol powder. And they showed the improvement in a lot of these folks from just taking mannitol. There's a blog called The Science of Parkinson's, and he has a couple of blog episodes where he talks about some of the science behind this, which can be helpful to understand that. But I came back from the meeting and I bought this little skinny little book on mannitol chemistry and started reading about mannitol chemistry. And the first chapter of the book showed the microbes that actually make mannitol from glucose and fructose. And I thought, well, you know, this is brilliant because they can convert those sugars that we're getting too much of. And we actually don't use mannitol. It comes out in our urine and our feces. So I had because I was in the space studying microbes, I had a fermentation scientist friend of mine, and I sat down with him with the book and I said, well, couldn't we put a team of bacteria together that would do this conversion in the gut and help us out? And so we put together this formula that eventually became Sugar Shift just for John. And at that time, John was struggling. He was walking with a cane. He couldn't navigate crowds very well. He had a lot of freezing, and we had been testing his gut bacteria for a long time, so we had a long data set. And so we just made a little batch for him and he started taking it. And within a month, he was not walking with the cane anymore. He was able to navigate through the crowd. And we tested for all the way up to 120 days, and we could see that his gut was remodeling and improving all along the way. And I mean, we eventually went on to study it in people with diabetes. So it, and we're still looking at the mechanisms of action, but some of the things that it does is it helps with detoxification. So detoxification of those chemicals that we're getting exposed to in the environment. It's converting those sugars. And so by doing that, it's not, it's taking those sugars away so that there are fewer pathogenic bacteria. So it's dropping what's called endotoxin, which is what comes from those bad bacteria. We have a paper coming out on that, and we already published our paper in diabetes on the improvement in insulin resistance. So it has a lot of different mechanisms of action, but I always tell people too, it's not a miracle solution, but I think it is part of a way that could actually help with all of these problems we have in the food supply and help support our gut. And there's a hypothesis called Brock's hypothesis now that has gained a lot of traction, that is that some infectious organism has come in through the nose or the mouth or both, and those present in different ways. But I don't think an oral probiotic is going to help your nasal passage, but it's definitely making a difference in the gut bacteria and the degrading of the organophosphates and some of the other heavy metals and things that we're exposed to in the food supply and also in the air as well.
So there's a question here in the chat which says, can you take sugar shift probiotic if you are pre-diabetic and take metformin? And does it contradict with other meds she can't find out from her doctor, such as losartan, Eliquis?
So I would ask the pharmacist about most of those. What I can tell you is the people who are in our diabetes clinical trial were taking insulin and metformin. I mean, not all of them, but in some combination, they were taking insulin and metformin, and there were no adverse reactions or any problems with the diabetes medications. What I don't know is, something like Eliquis, and that's a blood thinner, isn't it? I think it is. And, one of the things that I think is also interesting about that, as I'm still trying to understand what happened to John having a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot, if, a blood thinner might have been beneficial. And I've thought about that too, in terms of, so my mother had two sisters, and my mother and her oldest sister died very young. And the middle sister lived well into her 90s. But she took a blood thinner most of her life because she had a valve replacement in her 50s, I think. And so I just found that kind of interesting that, I don't know all the mechanisms of a blood thinner, but in the last, I'll say 3 or 4 months, I've come across quite a few people with Parkinson's who are also taking a blood thinner. And I don't know why. It's probably for some other comorbidity, but I find that interesting, and I'm curious if it actually helps with the Parkinson's symptoms at all.
Do you named your probiotic Sugar Shift? Do you think it curbs your sugar craving?
It does for a lot of people. What I would say is I find people who may have an underlying yeast infection, which can also contribute to a lot of different symptoms. And particularly very strong cravings. It can take quite some time to break the hold of a yeast infection. And so sometimes with somebody who has that underlying problem, it needs to be addressed in some other way. Like, I know they use nystatin or there's some other protocols, but what can happen when you start to remove that sugar is it actually starts to send signals to your brain to crave even more. So that's typically an indication, if it doesn't help with cravings, that there may be an underlying yeast infection, which also those can be associated with long-term use of antibiotics as well.
I wanted to comment on the.
Who has a question? Is that Melik?
Yeah.
Can you talk louder, Melik?
Yeah,
Melik introduced me to you.
One second, I want to get off the Bluetooth.
Okay.
1 minute. Or I'm going to just scream because I don't know how to get off the Bluetooth right now. Hold on. Okay, so here we
Go check out this stuff right now. It's bad.
Okay. I'll put on the video too.
Okay, thanks. Melik is the connection from me to you, Martha, just so you know.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hi, Martha. The blood thinner, I think what happens in Parkinson's is like I developed heart problems, cardiovascular problems, arrhythmia. So because of arrhythmia, they recommend to take blood thinners. And my mother, who has Parkinson's also, she's 92. She has senility because of like small strokes.
Mhm.
But because of I always felt because she's taking blood thinners, she actually did not have a big stroke. So she's like 92 years old and still walking around and talking and everything. So I also wanted to ask you, I feel like the sleep is very important for us. And I think a lot of damage happens to us when we are at night trying to sleep. I heard that the blood pressure goes up. Like usually it's supposed to go down during the night, and it goes up during the night. And my daughter was telling me that she saw me when I was at night sleeping. My breathing changed, and I started doing reverse breathing. So I feel like during the day I exercise and do so many things, and I feel better. But I go to sleep and I wake up and I'm not feeling well. I feel like the nighttime undoes whatever we do during the day. Did you hear anything of that? Like, do you know any research?
So I do know that nighttime is when our brain flushes out the trash. So that's like the what's newly discovered they call the glymphatic system. So we know we have a lymph system. Well, the glymph is just kind of a wider spread trash removal system, and we need to go into deep restorative sleep in order for that to happen. And I think there are a number of factors in Parkinson's with dysregulation of a couple of the hormones that regulate our sleep, whether that's, cortisol, antidiuretic hormone, aldosterone. And what I did notice with John was after having COVID for a long period of time, he had a lot of trouble regulating blood pressure. And he had trouble sleeping because he had to get up and go to the bathroom. Or I also noticed like a sleep apnea, a deep, long pause in his breathing, which I think too goes back to the movement of gases in the body, which is going back to what this Australian scientist I'm working working with, is looking at the movement of what he calls tiny gas nanobubbles that are moving in and out of our circulation. And so there, I don't know. Well, so restless leg is something that is, a REM sleep disorder. Both of those are sleep disrupting things that often precede a diagnosis with Parkinson's. And I think that actually the REM sleep disorder, almost 100% of those people go on to develop Parkinson's. So there's something in the ability, the disruption of the ability to get into very deep restorative sleep to enable the body to clear out the debris. And
You also have a product called Sleep Slumber. Is that something that?
simple slumber. I haven't looked at that in people with Parkinson's. One thing I will say though, so one of the key amino acids involved in sleep is tryptophan. And that tryptophan kynurenine pathway, if you go back to the gut bacteria and what they're making, so bacteria or plants, so there are 3 amino acids that we don't make ourselves. We have to get through our diet or through the bacteria in our gut. And those are tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. They're known as aromatic amino acids, and lots of different molecules are made from them, including dopamine. But that glyphosate that I talked about, the organophosphate fertilizers, they actually target and break the pathway that makes those amino acids. So I feel very strongly that that's a big driver of all the sleep disruption. I mean, not just in Parkinson's, so many people are unable to get a good quality night's sleep. And I think it's because we are just getting exposed to more and more and more of, these chemicals in our environment, in the air, in the food, and even in the water. And so you can't get a good night's sleep if you don't have the basic building blocks to make those hormones and neurotransmitters that are involved in sleep.
Okay.
And
So,
I have one last question.
Okay.
That sugar substitute the Israelis were making, what was that?
It's called mannitol. So
Yeah.
mannitol is actually, it's the most abundant sugar in nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's widely, it's an osmoregulator. So it regulates the flow of fluid, in particular in plants that are under drought stress. And I also find it kind of interesting that the name mannitol,
Mm-hmm.
it actually comes from the root name manna, the manna in the desert, which,
Oh,
I just find that kind of interesting.
Yeah. Arlen Bennett is here. I remember seeing him drink mannitol drinks. I don't know if he's
yeah, I took mannitol for a year.
right. Did it help?
I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
I did so many other things at the same time. I'm not sure.
Right. Well, this has been very eye-opening, Martha, and I know everybody will have a lot of questions. I think we have to watch we have to breathe deep and be careful about what we're breathing, right? And we have to eat smart and be careful of stop those processed foods, and
I know that's a challenge, and it's a particular challenge, I think, for people with Parkinson's, especially people with Parkinson's who live by themselves. where, you know, they don't have a partner or someone helping to, you know, cook a quality meal or to share a quality meal. And so we reach for those convenience foods that are that are often processed.
Right.
And so that can be particularly challenging. So,
And it's easy, even all those fast food places, they use all those bad oils. So, you know, that's hard for us to go to also. We have to take the time and take care of ourselves with good food. It takes time. We have to have patience. And
we
there
are
are-
what we eat.
we are what we eat, right? Right. You know that very well.
Yes.
So thank you from the bottom of my heart and everybody here. Carol, do you have a question? You want to unmute?
Hi, I just wanted to say to people, be careful you don't go too wild on these alcohol sugars because they will give you diarrhea if you take too much. So you've been warned.
Yes, yeah, that is true. And I think, if you look at either the study or if you can find the Clinic Crowd, website, they do talk about, I think it was like smaller, I mean, it wasn't like large amounts, but I think sometimes what happens is somebody reads that and they think, oh, this is the answer and more is better. And, you know, more is not necessarily always better.
Yeah, just be careful with the mannitol, sorbitol, any of those. If you eat too much, you won't be leaving the house.
Martha, thank you for your time. We appreciate all your research and we always want to be in touch with you and keep up with all the work, all the great work that you're doing.
My eyes.
So
Well,
thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. And when I get ready to work on this stuff for the documentary, I'll follow up and see if any of your folks are interested.
Oh, we would love to join you. Any help that we can be.
Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.